She was 18 years old, sitting across from a Rolling Stone reporter for the first real interview of her life, and she said something that turned into a headline within hours. "It's obvious," she said. "All arrows point to that." She wasn't talking about a song or a tour or a tattoo. She was talking about how her father died. And what she said next is the reason this story still gets searched, quoted, and argued about almost a decade later. It sounds like a total conspiracy theory, and it sounds like bullshit, but all real fans and everybody in the family knows it. It was a setup. That's Paris Jackson, daughter of Michael Jackson, telling the world in plain language that she does not believe her father's death was an accident, not a tragic mistake by an overworked doctor, not a string of bad decisions that spiraled out of control. A setup. And once you actually look at what she said, when she said it, and what was happening in her life at that exact moment, the story becomes a lot more complicated than a single viral quote. For years, the world had a clean, official version of how Michael Jackson died. A doctor, a dangerous drug, a trial, a conviction. Case closed, at least as far as the legal system was concerned. Then his own daughter sat down for her first major interview and quietly dismantled the idea that any of that ever felt like closure to the people who actually loved him. This isn't a leaked document. It isn't a secret recording. It's a teenager who had spent her entire short life inside the eye of one of the most scrutinized deaths in modern history, finally speaking on the record about what she believes happened to her father. And to understand why her words carry so much weight, you have to go back to the moment everything changed for her family. Most people who talk about this story online describe it as a leak, as if some private document slipped out by accident and exposed a secret the Jackson family had been hiding. That framing makes for a great headline, but it is inaccurate, and getting it wrong actually undersells how significant her statement really was. There was no leak. There was no accident. Paris Jackson sat down willingly, on the record, with her name attached, and said something most adult children of famous people spend their entire lives avoiding. She put her honest belief about her father's death into the public record voluntarily, fully aware of how it would be received. That distinction matters because it changes how seriously the claim should be taken. A leaked document might be partial, taken out of context, or stripped of nuance by whoever released it. A direct, on-the-record statement from the person closest to the situation carries a different kind of weight. It's not gossip. It's not a rumor traced back to an anonymous source. It's the daughter of Michael Jackson, speaking in her own words, about her own father in an interview she chose to give. On June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson was found unresponsive in his rented Holmby Hills mansion. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead a few hours later. He was 50 years old. Within days, the cause started to come into focus. He had been given a combination of sedatives that night, capped off by a dose of propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic that has no business being used to treat insomnia in a bedroom with no monitoring equipment. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office eventually ruled the death a homicide, caused by acute propofol intoxication with other sedatives in his system. Dr. Conrad Murray, his personal physician at the time, was charged with involuntary manslaughter, found guilty in 2011, and sentenced to 4 years, of which he served roughly half before being paroled. That's the official record. A doctor administered a dangerous drug irresponsibly, failed to monitor his patient properly, and delayed calling for help once something went wrong. A jury heard the evidence and convicted him. On paper, that should have closed the book. But for the people who actually loved Michael Jackson, the people who grew up calling him Dad, a courtroom verdict doesn't always answer the question that matters most to them. It doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you who else might have benefited from what happened. And for Paris Jackson, 11 years old when she lost her father and 18 when she finally spoke about it publicly, the legal outcome never felt like the whole truth. Before we get into what she said years later, it's worth remembering how Paris Jackson first appeared in front of the entire world. At her father's memorial service in 2009, an 11-year-old girl stepped up to a microphone in front of a global television audience and through tears said that her father was the best father you could ever imagine. It was raw, it was unscripted, and it became one of the most replayed moments of that entire summer. She wasn't a public figure who chose this life. She was a child who had just lost her dad in the most public way imaginable, surrounded by cameras, lawsuits, and a media circus that showed no signs of slowing down. For years afterward, she stayed mostly out of the spotlight, raised alongside her brothers by her grandmother, Katherine Jackson. While the adults around her fought legal battles in courtrooms she wasn't old enough to sit in. That silence is part of why her 2017 interview hit as hard as it did. This wasn't a tabloid plant or publicist strategy. This was the first time the world heard in detail what Michael Jackson's own daughter actually believed about how he died. The interview ran in Rolling Stone under the title Paris Jackson, Life After Neverland. And it covered far more than her father's death. She talked about depression, about multiple suicide attempts, about sexual assault, about her identity and her relationship with fame. But the section that exploded online was the part where the reporter asked her directly whether she believed her father had been murdered. Her answer wasn't hesitant. "Absolutely," she said. Because it's obvious. All arrows point to that. She went on to describe her father dropping hints in the years before his death, telling her that people were out to get him. At one point, according to her account, he told her plainly, "They're going to kill me one day." When asked who might have wanted him dead, she didn't name a single suspect. Her answer was broader and, in some ways, more unsettling because of that. "A lot of people," she said. She also pointed at the concert promotion company behind his planned comeback tour, AEG Live, suggesting that the pressure of the rehearsal schedule played a role in pushing him toward the drugs that ultimately killed him. She remembered watching dust fall from the ceiling while he rehearsed upstairs, exhausted, unable to sleep, even as doctors were feeding him escalating doses of sedatives to try to force rest that his body simply wouldn't give him. She called the whole situation a chess game, one she said she was trying to play correctly in pursuit of what she called justice for her father. Here's where this story needs a moment of careful unpacking, because two words get used almost interchangeably online when they actually mean very different things in a legal and medical context. The coroner ruled Michael Jackson's death a homicide. To a lot of people, that word alone sounds like confirmation of murder. It isn't. In a coroner's report, homicide simply means death caused by the actions of another person. It's a classification, not a verdict. It opens the door to a criminal investigation, but it doesn't determine intent, and it definitely doesn't assign motive. Conrad Murray's actions that night, administering a hospital-grade anesthetic in a bedroom with no crash cart, no ventilator, and apparently no real record-keeping, fit the definition of homicide, because his negligence directly caused a death. That's exactly what the criminal case was built around, and that's exactly what he was convicted of. What it does not mean is that someone orchestrated a plan to kill Michael Jackson. The legal system addressed negligence. It never addressed because there was never evidence presented to support anything resembling a deliberate plot. Paris Jackson's claim operates on a different level entirely. She isn't disputing that Murray administered the fatal drugs. She's suggesting that larger forces, possibly financial, possibly tied to the pressure of the comeback tour, set the conditions that made his death inevitable, whether or not any single person intended for him to die that specific night. That's an important distinction because it means her belief and the jury's verdict aren't necessarily contradicting each other. They're answering two different questions. The jury answered who broke the law in that bedroom. Paris was answering something closer to who, in her eyes, bears moral responsibility for the circumstances that put her father in that position in the first place. To really weigh Paris Jackson's claim against the official record, it helps to know exactly what investigators and prosecutors established about those final hours, because the level of detail that came out during Conrad Murray's trial is far more specific than most people realize. According to the timeline that emerged from the investigation, Murray spent hours at Jackson's bedside on the night of June 24th into the early morning of June 25th, administering a sequence of sedatives that included diazepam, lorazepam, and midazolam. Jackson, who had been dealing with severe, sustained insomnia in the lead-up to his planned London shows, still could not fall asleep. According to Murray's own account, given to detectives in a recorded interview just 2 days after Jackson's death, Jackson kept asking for what he called milk, a nickname he reportedly used for propofol, the surgical anesthetic he had apparently used before to force sleep. Murray told investigators he had actually been trying to wean Jackson off the drug, worried that his patient had become dependent on it. After hours of resistance, he eventually gave in. At 10:40 in the morning, he injected Jackson with a diluted dose of propofol. What happened immediately after that injection is the part that turned this from a tragic medical event into a criminal case. Prosecutors argued that Murray failed to properly monitor Jackson afterward, the exact opposite of how the drug is supposed to be used, and that once Jackson stopped breathing, Murray delayed calling emergency services by close to 20 minutes. In a medical emergency involving a drug that suppresses breathing, that gap is not a minor detail. It's often the entire difference between survival and death. Medical experts who later reviewed the case for various academic and legal analyses described Murray's conduct as a severe departure from any reasonable standard of care. One widely cited review broke the failures down point by point, using a surgical anesthetic to treat insomnia outside of a hospital setting, failing to secure any kind of informed consent, administering the drug without monitoring equipment present, delaying the call for help, and then performing resuscitation efforts that were themselves inadequate once the emergency was finally recognized. Some analyses went further, cataloging more than a dozen separate violations that each independently posed a foreseeable danger to Jackson's life. This is the version of events that a jury actually heard, weighed, and convicted on. It's a story about catastrophic negligence by one specific, identifiable person, supported by recorded testimony in his own voice. It is not, on its face, a story about a coordinated plot involving multiple unnamed parties. That gap between what was proven in court and what Paris Jackson later described as obvious is exactly where the public disagreement over this story lives. If you want to understand where Paris Jackson's suspicion of a lot of people actually came from, you need to look at a courtroom battle that played out years before her interview and got far less attention than the criminal trial. Michael Jackson's mother, Katherine Jackson, filed a massive civil lawsuit against AEG Live, the company that was promoting his planned comeback shows, the This Is It concert series set for London's O2 Arena. The argument at the center of that case was straightforward. AEG hired Conrad Murray. AEG had the resources and the obligation to vet who they were putting in charge of their headlining act's medical care. And according to the lawsuit, there were warning signs about Murray's judgment and qualifications that should have been visible if anyone had bothered to look closely. That trial ran for more than 5 months, an enormous undertaking that pulled back the curtain on the business side of Jackson's final months. Financial pressure, an exhausting rehearsal schedule, a company with hundreds of millions of dollars riding on a 50-year-old performer making it through dozens of shows. All of it came up in testimony. In October of 2013, the jury reached its decision, and it did not favor the Jackson family. Jurors found that while AEG had indeed hired Murray, he was, in their assessment, qualified enough for the job he was brought on to do. That finding cleared AEG of financial liability. Katherine Jackson's legal team pushed for a new trial, arguing the verdict form given to jurors had been flawed, but a judge ultimately rejected that request, and the ruling stood. So when Paris talks about AEG potentially working her father to death, she isn't inventing a connection out of nowhere. She's referencing a real legal theory that an actual jury heard and actual lawyers argued in an actual Los Angeles courtroom. The jury simply didn't find enough evidence to hold the company financially responsible. That's a different outcome than saying the underlying concern itself was baseless. One phrase from that interview deserves its own attention because it raises a question that the rest of the conversation glosses over. Paris said that everybody in the family knows it, referring to her belief that her father was murdered. If that's true, it means this wasn't a private theory she came up with on her own as a grieving teenager. It means this was something discussed, processed, and apparently agreed upon by multiple people inside the Jackson family circle. That detail matters because it shifts the story from one person's grief reaction into something closer to a family consensus, even if that consensus was never formally stated by any other family member on the record in the same way. Other relatives have made comments over the years hinting at distrust toward people in Michael's orbit during his final months, but Paris was the first to put a direct, unambiguous label on it in a major interview. Michael's father, Joe Jackson, had also pursued his own wrongful death lawsuit against Conrad Murray separately, running alongside the larger civil action against AEG. That lawsuit, on its own, signals that at least one other senior member of the family viewed Murray's role as something requiring direct legal accountability beyond what the criminal courts had already delivered. It's a separate legal action from the AEG case, but it reinforces the same underlying picture, a family that did not consider the criminal conviction the end of the story, and that kept pursuing additional avenues of accountability for years after the original trial concluded. It's worth being honest about what this is and isn't. It's a window into what a family believes, shaped by years of grief, legal battles, and a deeply public death that left them without the kind of closure most families get to grieve in private. It is not new physical evidence. It is not a confession. It is not a document that surfaced after the case had closed. It's a family's collective interpretation of events that a jury already evaluated under a much stricter legal standard. If Paris Jackson's claims were as explosive as the headlines made them sound, a natural question follows. Why didn't this trigger a new criminal investigation? The answer is simpler than any conspiracy theory floating around online. Belief, even strongly held belief from someone close to the victim, is not evidence in a legal sense. Prosecutors need something concrete to reopen a closed case. New forensic material, a witness willing to testify to specific facts, documentation that wasn't previously available. Paris never presented a name, piece of evidence, or a specific new claim that pointed to a particular person engineering her father's death. Her statement was an assertion of belief about overall responsibility and intent, not a piece of actionable information that law enforcement could follow up on. It's not a criticism of her. Grief doesn't require evidentiary standards to feel real or valid, but it does explain why no district attorney's office announced a renewed inquiry after the interview ran, despite how widely it was covered. The criminal case against Conrad Murray remained the only criminal case tied directly to Michael Jackson's death. The civil case against AEG remained closed after the 2013 verdict. No new charges against anyone were ever filed in connection with claims that the death was a deliberate plot rather than the result of medical negligence. It's easy to read a quote like, "All arrows point to that," as a dramatic soundbite built for headlines. It's harder, and more important, to sit with where that statement actually came from. In the same interview, Paris spoke openly about attempting to take her own life multiple times in the years following her father's death, including one attempt at age 15 that became public. She described struggling with depression and addiction during her teenage years, processing the loss of her father while living under a level of media attention that very few young people on Earth have ever had to handle. She was 11 when paramedics tried to revive her father in that bedroom. She was 11 when she stood in front of cameras at his memorial and tried to say goodbye to him in front of millions of strangers. By the time she sat down with Rolling Stone at 18, she had spent more years grieving in public than most people spend grieving at all. Her belief that her father was murdered didn't arrive out of nowhere. It arrived after nearly a decade of watching legal proceedings unfold around her, hearing testimony about his final hours, and living with a loss that the rest of the world treated as entertainment news. None of that proves her theory correct, but it does explain why she holds it as firmly as she does, and why dismissing it outright misses something important about what families go through when a loved one's death becomes public property. What makes this story worth revisiting now isn't just the 2017 interview itself. It's that Paris Jackson's relationship with her father's legacy, and with the broader allegations that have surrounded him for decades, has continued to shift in the years since. In more recent interviews, she has acknowledged having direct, candid conversations with some of the people who have accused her father of abuse during his lifetime, conversations that reportedly influenced how she now views some of those allegations. That's a separate issue from the murder claim, and it's important not to blur the two together. One is about how he died. The other is about who he was and what, if anything, he may have done during his life. But both threads point to the same underlying reality. Paris Jackson has never treated her father's story as settled. She has been willing, publicly and repeatedly, to revisit, question, and update her own understanding of him, even when doing so put her at odds with parts of his most devoted fan base. That willingness to keep examining the past, rather than locking it into a single narrative, is, in its own way, the most honest thread running through everything she's said over the years. It's worth zooming out for a moment, because Paris Jackson's belief doesn't exist in isolation. Sudden public deaths of major celebrities almost always produce some version of this exact pattern. Elvis Presley, Tupac Shakur, Whitney Houston. In nearly every case, official investigations reach a conclusion, usually pointing to a mix of substance misuse, medical negligence, or some combination of both. And in nearly every case, a portion of the public, Sirius style, home times including people close to the deceased, continues to believe the full story was never told. There are real reasons this pattern repeats so consistently. Sudden death, without a clear, satisfying explanation, is psychologically difficult to accept, especially for people who loved the person who died. A medical accident, however well documented, can feel too small and too random to match the size of the loss. A deliberate plot, even an unproven one at least, offers a narrative shape. Someone wanted this. Someone caused this on purpose. That story, however unsettling, can feel more bearable than the idea that a life of that magnitude ended because of a careless decision made in a bedroom with no real medical equipment. None of that means every conspiracy belief is automatically wrong. It simply means that grief and suspicion tend to travel together, especially when the official explanation, however well supported by evidence, still leaves enormous emotional questions unanswered. Why did the people around him let this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it sooner? Who really benefited financially from his death, given how much money was tied up in his estate, his catalog, and the comeback tour he never got to perform? Those questions don't have clean legal answers, and that absence of a clean answer is often where suspicion grows roots. Paris Jackson's comments fit squarely inside that broader pattern, but they also stand apart from it in one important way. Most conspiracy theories around celebrity deaths come from outside observers, fans, bloggers, anonymous forum posters with no direct connection to the people involved. Hers came from inside the family, from someone who was actually there, who actually grew up inside the chaos that followed, and who had direct access to context the rest of us will never have. That doesn't make her right, but it does make her claim categorically different from the usual internet speculation that swirls around famous deaths. The reaction to Paris Jackson's comments split almost immediately along predictable lines. Outlets that had covered the Conrad Murray trial closely tended to frame her statement carefully, noting that it represented her personal belief rather than new evidence. Other coverage leaned harder into the dramatic framing, running headlines built almost entirely around the word murdered without much context about what she meant or where the claim came from. That second category of coverage is a big part of why the story still circulates in distorted forms years later, stripped of the nuance she actually offered in the full interview. Fans of Michael Jackson were similarly divided. Some treated her words as confirmation of suspicions they had held for years, pointing to AG's financial stake in the comeback tour as obvious motive. Others pushed back, arguing that a teenager's grief, however understandable, shouldn't be treated as a substitute for the actual forensic and legal record that had already been established in court. Both reactions came from a place of genuinely caring about how Michael Jackson is remembered, even though they pulled in completely opposite directions. What got lost in a lot of that back and forth was the more measured reality sitting in between those two extremes. Paris wasn't claiming to have evidence. She was describing a feeling built over years, shaped by closeness to the situation that none of us had. Treating her words as either gospel truth or baseless teenage speculation, both miss what she was actually offering, which was an honest, if unprovable, perspective from inside a tragedy the rest of the world only experienced through headlines. So where does that leave us? On one side, you have a documented legal record, a coroner's homicide ruling based on toxicology and forensic evidence, a criminal trial that resulted in Conrad Murray's conviction for involuntary manslaughter, a civil trial against AEG Live that ended with the company cleared of financial liability. None of that is in dispute. All of it is part of the public record, available for anyone to read. On the other side, you have the lived experience and belief of a daughter who lost her father in the most public way imaginable, who grew up surrounded by lawyers, headlines, and unanswered questions, and who has said plainly that she believes there was more to his death than negligence alone. That belief deserves to be heard with empathy, but it also deserves to be understood for what it actually is. Not a new piece of evidence, not a legal claim, a family's interpretation of a tragedy that the justice system addressed in its own narrower way. The two things can both be true at once. The legal system can have correctly identified and punished the specific negligence that caused Michael Jackson's death, and a grieving family can still feel, with total sincerity, that the full picture was never actually uncovered. That tension between what a courtroom can prove and what a family chooses to believe is the real story hiding underneath every viral headline about Paris Jackson's comments. It isn't a secret leak. It isn't a hidden document. It's a daughter speaking honestly about a loss that never fully made sense to her in the only way she's had available to her, in public, under her own name, carrying a story that the rest of us only ever watched from the outside.